To begin, let me hold up this week's Spectator again. Migration Nation is the cover piece, and it's about the news that the government is expected to soon announce or even admit that legal migration, net legal migration, is somewhere around 700,000 immigrants coming into this country. It's a lot higher than was expected, and Fraser Nelson explores the possibility that it may be being used to cover up the large number of British people who are on benefits. He joins me now to explain his thesis, along with the politician turned broadcaster Nigel Farage. Fraser, I think what people find most striking about your piece is that Brexit seems to have meant more immigration, not less, because that was not what we were told it would do.
Now, during the campaign, both the Leave and Remain campaigns argued that Brexit would mean significantly less immigration. You couldn't find any economic analysis of Brexit that didn't assume that net migration would go down quite significantly. Now, you had some people on the Leave campaign were saying, you know what, this is what we need. Fewer migration, and therefore scarce workers have become more scarce, therefore the salaries go up. And on the Remain side, there was a moment where Stuart Rose, the former M&S chief, was in question time, and he rather famously said, yes, there'll be fewer migration, that means more demand for labourers, and labour costs will go up, and that's not a good thing. So you had the two sides disagreeing on whether it was good or bad that you would end up with less migration and perhaps higher salaries for the low paid. You could argue, yeah, people would be paying more money for their pizza, the waiters are paid more, that kind of argument. But nobody disagreed that Brexit would significantly lower migration and it would be a better way of managing globalisation. That it's got a bit out of control under the Blair period. In many ways, almost the whole point of leaving the EU was to take back control of border policy, so we would exit the system of free movement and being able to decide how many we'd want. What we now find is when they've taken back control, the government's giving almost 500,000 visas a year. And when you include the students, who nowadays apparently have got 1 and 2 dependents in tow, the number hits 700,000 or probably more. We're going to get that next week. But this isn't an accident, because Rishi Sunak has now got complete control. He can decide whether to issue a visa or not. So this is deliberate policy, but one that hasn't been announced and one that hasn't been explained. And I think it should be.
Well, we should say that by Spectator office standards, you are something of a dove on immigration. You're certainly a dove compared to the man sitting on your left. But you still find this very troubling because of unemployment, because of long-term sickness, because of the fact that a lot of British natives are in a welfare trap, essentially.
Yeah, I think the mass immigration has been overall quite a stunning success for Britain. We have had a massive demographic change. 1 in 5 of our workers now is foreign born. I think in London, half of all children have got an immigrant mother, including, I should say, my own 3 kids. I'm contributing to this phenomenon. And I think that we've managed it in an incredibly successful way. If you look at the coronation, for example, a couple of weeks ago, we had a Hindu Prime Minister, Buddhist Home Secretary, Muslim Mayor of London, Muslim First Minister of Scotland. In no other country in the world would you have had this picture of successful integration. So we pulled it off very, very well. And I think we continue to pull it off well. We're finding out via the statisticians that we're getting 750,000 net migration. There hasn't been riots in the street about it. There's no populist party. I mean, a while ago, Nigel was running the Brexit party talking about immigration. They were used to be coming first in the European elections only a few years ago. Now there is nothing to the right of the Conservatives. Richard Tice's lot fielded 500 candidates of the locals. They got something like 5 or 6 candidates through, a dreadful success rate. So we don't have any what you might call anti-immigrant populist party or anything approaching that description, either in Parliament or in the opinion polls. So the public seem to be quite happy with this. If there is unhappiness, it hasn't expressed itself politically. Now, where I'm concerned is I think, although immigration works very well, it can perhaps work too well. The temptation politically to use this to cover up the failures of the welfare state is very great. Like earlier on this week, we had figures coming out showing 5.3 million Brits earn out-of-work benefits. We would really notice this if it wasn't for mass immigration, because we wouldn't have anybody to run the economy. But when we can cover it up with mass migration, it works.
Nigel, you made some waves this week by saying that Brexit has failed.
Well, hang on a second. I said Brexit's failed because of what the government's done with it.
Yes.
Number one, we haven't actually helped business. Businesses are leaving. We've got a brain drain going on for the first time since the 1970s. Secondly, there's an absolute breach of trust with the electorate over immigration. It's absolutely perfectly clear. The only reason we won that referendum were people turning out on council estates in the Midlands of the North thinking, you know what, this is the one time my vote can make a difference. And thirdly, Brexit is failing because it's actually turned out that our politicians are about as useless as the European Commission. Now, that doesn't mean voting to get back sovereignty was wrong, far from it. But in the minds of ordinary Brexit voters, this isn't working. And I'd remind Fraser, there were a third group of people in that referendum talking about immigration, those that didn't want to talk about it at all. I remember being told, by Hannan and Boris Johnson, no, don't discuss immigration in the referendum, we'll lose the referendum. Some of our very posh friends don't like this sort of thing. In the end, they were forced to talk about it reluctantly. But they never, ever, Boris never intended to reduce the numbers of people coming into this country. So the first fundamental question to address is that breach of faith. I think it's very strong and very real. And secondly, let me say this. The electorate assumed with Brexit that immigration had been dealt with. And they're now beginning to understand that it hasn't been dealt with. And you may well say there's no populist party in British politics at the moment. There will be. It's coming. The disconnect is bigger now than it was in 2010. I could see in 2010 that the political and media class in London just had no idea what everybody else in the country was talking about. And I think we're heading back to that, and quite quickly.
Let's get on to the future of populist politics in a moment, because I think that's where this should go. For now, it's fair to say, polls suggest that immigration has dipped in terms of the issue which voters consider most important. I think it's now fourth, or is it fifth now?
Well, if it's not being discussed, that's not surprising. I mean, if there is no coverage of the issue and people don't know what's going on, that's not surprising. The reason that immigration became the big political issue that it was is that people in their minds linked it to membership of the European Union. That was what the UKIP surge was all about.
That's what you successfully did.
Yes, and it took me years. Yeah. It took me years to make that connection. And from 2004, I said to all the people working with me, once I can make this connection, this political party is going to a different place. I think over the course of the next year or two, people will start to make the connection that the reason there's a housing crisis is mass immigration. The reason they can't get a GP appointment is mass immigration. The reason their lives are more miserable than they were 10 years ago, their quality of life is diminishing, is because of the population crisis and explosion in this country.
But in what way is it a crisis?
You're living in London, earning good money, living in a lovely house, talking about rich Hindus who happen to be our Prime Minister. Go out onto the council estates, meet people.
I think you'll see the odd Hindu.
Do you know my driver's kid didn't go to school last year. The school's too full. 13 years old, not at school.
Right, so your driver, what you're saying that the local authorities refuse to provide his child with a place because there are no education places.
That's right.
I very much doubt that.
It's happening all over the country.
It doesn't. It's illegal for councils to refuse people.
No. Home education has been given online, no place at schools. You go to Lincolnshire, for example, you'll find 4.5, 5-year-olds, maybe 20 miles on a bus to get to school. There is a population explosion that is damaging and diminishing the quality of life of ordinary folk in this country. If you don't see it now, I promise you, you will see it.
But why is it, what I can't work out is this, if there is this anger, then why hasn't it got no political expression? Why does why the Reform Party do so incredibly badly? Just a few weeks ago,
if we polled 1,000 people in Stoke-on-Trent now and asked who the Reform Party was, I wonder how many would know that it even exists. That's the problem. We may know because we live in this world. Ordinary folk don't know, and actually establishing political movements is not an easy thing to do. And Reform is effectively, it may be a follow-on from the Brexit Party, but effectively it's a new political party. So two things I would say. Number one, the reason we're not seeing this expressed more is because it's not been given voice, but it's beginning to be. We're having this national debate now about numbers. And number two, there's not a political leader that people can see at this moment in time voicing their concerns. Once those connections are made between, everything, even travel, even the length of journeys, potholes in the roads, these are all symptoms of a population crisis, and it's going to dominate British politics over the next 10 years.
Is it not a problem then that, if, as you say, because of Brexit, or Brexit came about because people linked the European Union and mass migration, Now people will say, well, we've had Brexit and we still have mass migration.
No, what they'll say is they lied to us.
Yeah.
They lied to us.
But maybe they want us control over immigration. That's the big difference. Can I put it to you, Nigel, that before there was palpably no control. Free movement, that's what it means, right? You can control it. Now, right now, if you look at who's coming in, there are different people, but not the pools. The Indians are now number one, followed, I think, by Australians. Then you have Nigerians, then you have Americans. Now, to get a visa for this country, you need to be over a certain salary threshold, you need to speak English, you need to be getting a job in a certain profession. Those are the criteria.
Hang on a second. I mean, the salary criteria, when Australia does this, it says we're short of engineers, we're short of people in these sectors, we will open up spaces in this sector. In nearly every single case, those that go to Australia are earning more than the average wage. What this government have done is they've lowered the thresholds to the most unimaginable levels, where actually the threshold to come in is £8,000 to £10,000 lower than the average wage. That's why the numbers are where they are. They have deliberately engineered this, and of course they've got their big business friends encouraging it. But equally, as you point out in your article, there is this massive welfareism problem of 5.3 million people, and it appears at the minute that no political party's got the courage to take that on. So it's all well and good to say you have to pass these tests to come in, but we've set the threshold so low in terms of qualifications and income, as for it to almost be meaningless.
Maybe this is making it more palatable, though. Maybe that is why, when there's a recent poll asking people all over the world what do you think of immigration, Britain emerged as the most pro-immigrant country in the world, other than, I think, Norway. And I wonder if that's because we see migration differently now. Now that Brexit has come along, we know that to get a visa you need a job. Nobody's really talking about lazy foreigners who aren't really... these are people who are by and large more likely to work than Brits now.
Nobody was ever talking about lazy foreigners. That was never the argument. The argument was about wage compression. The argument was about difficulties getting onto social housing lists. The argument was about fundamental changes in community. The argument was about the fact, well, why is no one speaking English in this street? They were very, very different arguments, and they were arguments very firmly rooted around community, around family, and of course the ironic social conservatism of so many Labour voters, which actually is still there. I mean, those red wall voters are surprisingly small c conservative and patriotic people in many, many ways. So no, I think that the idea that, well, we've got back control, we've chosen not to use it, but we've got control, so we're all happy, I think it's for the birds.
I mean, you focused a lot on illegal migration in your immigration,
yes.
in your journalism and so on.
Yes.
Do you think the fact that that is such a media preoccupation distracts from the issue of legal migration, which, as you say, is...
The reason I did that, the reason I went on this illegal immigration thing back in sort of late 19, early 20, is because nobody else wanted to talk about it. It was literally being buried under the carpet. So I thought, well, I'm going to cause a bit of noise on this and because it was obvious to me in 2020 that the numbers that came would explode, because virtually nobody was being deported anywhere else, and you can come in, be put in a hotel, you literally stay in a 4-star hotel and go to work every day in the black economy and earn cash. It's happening all over the country. So I pushed that because I wanted it to become a big issue. Also because, my fear from 2015, and the reason that I used that breaking point poster that so upset the metropolitan elite, is that the EU have made the same mistake with the Mediterranean, and I feared that unless we got a grip through Brexit, that we'd face a similar wave. Now, it may not be the same numerically, but symbolically, the boats crossing the English Channel is. And by the way, the numbers that have crossed into Europe so far across the Med is treble last year. So there's more of this coming. But ironically, yes, everyone's now become so focused on what's been happening illegally with 46,000 people last year that you're right. It's kind of stopped us talking about legal net numbers.
I remember you accepted an award at the Spectator's Parliamentarian of the Year Awards a few years ago, and you said, "You'll never hear from me again."
Well,
I have to ask you, do you think that there's obviously a space opening up to the right of Rishi Sunak, particularly on the issue of immigration? Will you be going back into...
I think it's bigger than that. I think the absolute betrayal of the 5.5 million men and women who are sole traders and self-employed. I mean, you can't believe the anger in that community out there. They loathe the Conservative Party. They fear Labour will be even worse, but they loathe the Conservative Party. The complete lack of understanding of how the IR35 rules in practice are working in the building industry, etc. So it isn't just on immigration. There is I think the sense of detachment that the conversations that are happening in Westminster are so far removed from ordinary people's lives. I mean, when I campaigned with the Brexit Party in 2019, quite successfully, we got rid of Mrs May, and I'm rather proud of that. But the slogan we campaigned on wasn't even about Brexit. It was change politics for good. There was a hope and a feeling that a different kind, a more engaged kind of politics would come from Brexit. None of that's happened. So the answer to your question is very simple. The gap that is opening up in British politics on the centre-right is potentially bigger than it was with UKIP. Yeah. I mean, it's a very, very big gap.
You very skillfully didn't listen to the second part of my question, which is, will you try and fill that gap?
Well, I haven't finished yet. Just
okay.
Give me a moment. I wasn't ignoring you. I can be accused of many things, but not ignoring questions. So the potential is there, and something or someone at some point is going to fill it. You know, I sort of call it an anger gap. Now, it depends who fills that anger gap. I hope and believe what I did before was a positive way of filling it by saying, let's get our sovereignty back as a means of dealing with these problems. Before I came along, already came to prominence, the anger gap was being filled by Nick Griffin. And it's very easy to forget, between 2005 and 2010, the extent to which the BNP were laying down roots, you know, in those northern town councils, etc. I haven't decided what I'm going to do. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I do feel that a large chunk of the country deserves some representation and deserves a voice. Equally, I'm still pretty bruised by the 2015 general election. How can you get 4 million votes in one seat? It makes it a very difficult thing to do. I haven't decided what I'm going to do, but something's going to come along, and if it's not me, it'll be a Nick Griffin Mark II. You know, we will have a rise of something way out on the right. It's happening as we speak all over Europe, albeit aided by a proportional representation system. Something is going to change, something is going to crack. And I think, coming back to UK politics, you know, I think I've got a better understanding of those Red Wall voters than pretty much anybody, frankly. They were the people that were the backbone that built UKIP up into being a major party in British politics. And if the Conservative Party on its current course thinks it's got any chance of winning a single one of those seats, then I'm afraid they're deluded. The only thing that might save us is this. The one thing the Conservative Party is really good at is survival. You know, it's been around for a couple of 100 years. It exists to attempt to get power and to hold power. So they've still got time, I guess, if they chose to be genuinely radical, but I can't see it happening.
By radical, you mean cutting the number of visas issued? That's your definition. Because the funny thing is, we've just had local elections, and how many parties of various stripes, different species, not a sign, not a sniff of the sort of anger that you're talking about. But I wonder, is it real or might it be?
Because there's no way. But that was that was the same effectively before 2010. You know, other than the BNP.
No, you were just telling us Nick Griffin was getting a huge number of votes. There was palpable anger then.
The BNP in the north, but they had a big presence. At the moment, if you want to vote that way, there's nobody giving voice to it. That's the gap in the market.
But it looks like a lot of those voters are going back to Labour now.
Yes, I've met them this weekend.
Yeah,
I've met them this weekend.
Why do you think they're going back to Labour? Is it because Keir Starmer's talking to the right on some things?
No, I think this Tory party, they don't identify with these Conservative politicians at all. They briefly did with Boris for a bit. He seemed rather fun. He seemed rather normal.
They identify with Keir Starmer, do they?
No, not really.
So why are they going back to Labour?
Because they're tribal Labour. That's where they come from. They've been voted. Their families have voted Labour since 1918. You know, the sort of the gateway drug of UKIP and the Brexit Party took them to the Conservatives in 2019, and that was on a Brexit. Let's get this thing sorted out. Let's get back control of our borders. But they're going back to Labour because that's where they're from. And I think there's also a profound sense of disappointment that the Brexit thing has not worked out the way they really wanted it to.
I think we'll wrap it up there. But thank you very much, Nigel, for coming in, and thank you, Fraser, for talking about your cover piece.